If you guys want some gamer subs, make sure to use code GM for 10% off. Yo, what's going on, guys? It's Gmonitors here. A little while back, I made my exotic primary weapon tier list for PvE, and you guys said that you wanted to see some lists for both special weapons and heavy weapons, so that's exactly what we have today. I'm going to be ranking every single special weapon from S tier down to F tier based on where it currently is and not from any previous time periods in Destiny. S tier will be for weapons that are super useful in endgame PvE, and then F tier will be for those that are useless in PvE. And then everything else will just fall in between. And I also did want to mention that I asked you guys for some help in my Discord server as to where you thought some of the exotics should rank. So in the future, if you guys are interested in helping out with videos, make sure to join using the link in the description below. Where better to start this list off than by easing right into it with trace rifles. These things are practically primary weapons, but some of the exotic versions are actually super useful. The first trace rifle is the OG Cold Heart. This used to be the DPS meta back when Destiny began, back in the double primary days. It could fry Callus when 6 people ran it, but ever since year 1, this thing has had no place in the meta. Personally, this thing has just been taking up space in my vault, and with newer and better exotics, I really don't think this thing will ever shine again. In PvE, it still kills adds just fine and is usable, so I don't think it's an F tier weapon, but it just isn't super worth the exotic slot, so this is going to be going in the D tier. Up next is Prometheus Lens. This was the second trace rifle we had access to in Destiny. I think the exotic perk Prismatic Inferno, which causes the AoE effect, is much more useful for ad clear compared to that of Cold Heart, and it was even used to help cheese the Gatekeeper encounter in Vault of Glass. With Solar 3.0 out now, I still feel like this weapon doesn't shine as much because there isn't a huge need to run solar weapons to synergize with your subclass. Overall, I think this is better in every aspect than Cold Heart, but not something I would consider using in harder content, so C tier seems like the perfect spot. Wave Splitter is pretty much just a Void version of the Cold Heart. It was recently updated to suppress targets with Void 3.0, but honestly, I don't see just having suppression on a weapon as a reason to run it when I could use other suppression sources. It does synergize with Void 3.0 and volatile rounds, but trace rifles seem to be pretty buggy and not proc volatile explosions as often as it should. So just like Cold Heart, I don't really think this thing has a solid place in the game right now, so this is also going in the D tier. Ruinous Effigy is next, which makes me realize we have way too many exotic trace rifles in the game. This exotic falls under the exact same category as Cold Heart and Wave Splitter as not really having a place. But the Orbit Generates can be used in some Infinite Invis builds, and the transmutation spheres that it makes are actually pretty strong. I think this thing definitely stands a bit higher up, but just slightly, so this one is going to be going next to Prometheus Lens in the C tier. Now is when things start to get good. The Divinity. I've made some videos going over why I think this thing is a bit overrated, but even still, it is hands down one of the best exotics in the entire game. It has built-in overload rounds, it allows players to hit crits easier, which makes damage phases more consistent. The perk Penance actually makes it deal okay damage considering it's a trace rifle, and oh yeah, it's the largest debuff in the game. This thing is useful in GMs, master raids, and day 1 clears. If any special weapon is deserving of an S tier, it's this one, so that is right where it's going. This finally brings us to our last trace rifle, which is Egger's Scepter. I call it Eggers, if you call it Agers, who cares? This was the first trace rifle that actually impressed me when it came to ad clear. Getting kills with this make it so you never have to reload, and then killing multiple enemies makes everything freeze. This synergizes with stasis subclasses more than any weapon in the game, and the catalyst makes it hit like a truck. Combining this with the Mantle of Battle Harmony makes it feel even better, and if it weren't for this thing, I would have significantly less Master VOD clears. I think this thing shines best in entry-level endgame content though, so for me, it's an A tier weapon. Currently, we have 4 exotic shotguns in the game right now that use special ammo, and most of them are trash for PvE. But that's really just because they are PvP weapons. The Chaperone is honestly my favorite weapon to use and has been for a while in the Crucible. I used it this past week and went flawless in trials, but in PvE, this thing is hella useless. I mean, sure, you can use it, but legendary slugs are gonna be better options, so this is just a solid F tier. I would say that the exact same thing applies for Duality. No need to go into detail with that, so just another F tier weapon. And then I also think that Lord of Wolves is mostly for PvP. In D1, it was actually super useful in PvE, but I haven't seen it used in the PvE meta in D2. I think it could be used, but the ammo economy wouldn't be ideal. So for me, it's another F tier weapon. The last and final shotgun is Fourth Horseman. Now this weapon is actually kinda nutty. As most people know, at any given point, this thing is usually the highest burst DPS weapon in the game. Its total damage output definitely lacks, but using this on a Hunter with Mask of Bacchus and Marksman Dodge make it a lot better. The Catalyst adds an extra shot, which plays super well into the perk Broadside. I wouldn't go as far as to say that this thing is always useful because of the range and ammo limitations, so B tier seems like the perfect spot for this. Next up are the brand new exotic glaives released with Witch Queen, all of which I don't have. I don't really have much to judge off of, but I have never once seen a single person use these, nor have I ever heard anyone say they were even remotely good. I honestly have only ever seen other reviews and videos going over how bad these were. The Titan Glaive lets you shoot down miniature bubbles, but you don't get weapons of light. The Warlock shoots off a healing turret, which I think is decent, I guess, but you could just run the Boots of the Assembler, and the Hunter one shoots off a chaining arc wave that seems pretty underwhelming. You can only ever do these once, by the way, and then you need almost the full shield back to use them again. To be fair, since I don't have them, I won't put them in the F tier, but they are going straight in the D tier, which I think is more than generous. In this list, we have two linear fusions. First up is Lorentz Driver, which I think for PvE is actually super strong. Obviously, linear fusion rifles hit really hard, even if they aren't heavies, and this weapon also gets bonus damage if you collect the 3 telemetries. The main reason I think this weapon is good is because of the perk EM Anomaly. Precision kills pull nearby enemies in and usually kill them with a detonation unless they're tankier adds. The Catalyst, however, makes this so that all enemies create the vortex while you have 3 telemetries active. This works really, really well together for some ad clear against beefier targets. Overall, I think this weapon is great, but isn't something I would take into GMs or master content, but definitely raids, so it's a great B tier weapon. The second linear we have is Arbalest. Even with the damage nerf it received, this thing is still an absolute beast. A recurring theme for some of the top exotics in the game is the addition of intrinsic champion mods. Arbalest comes stock with anti-barrier rounds, which make it great for strikes with barrier champions. But even better than that, it deals massive damage to all shields in the game. So with Arbalest, we are able to break any element of shield, even while match game is applied. This is huge because it completely removes the lock on loadout variability in GMs and master content. This thing also still deals great damage, and Disruption Break makes it do even more. And it has great ammo economy. With all of this, it is easily going down as the second S tier PvE weapon on the list. For the regular fusion rifles of the game, first up we have Bastion. I think this weapon is actually super strong despite most players overlooking it. It's useful for the duo deep zone crypt clear, and it has unstopped rounds built into it. I don't think the weapon does too well in endgame content, mostly because it doesn't deal the craziest amount of damage, and it has a very slow charge time, and it can also be a kind of awkward weapon to use with a 3-round burst. So overall, I think it's fair to put this weapon in the B tier. Up next is everybody's favorite troublemaker, Telesto. This thing is hands down the most broken weapon in Destiny history, and not broken in a good way. I mean, sometimes it is, like when you could generate a full super by destroying its pellets, unless you used it in PvP, but other times this weapon has notoriously crashed games. When working as intended though, I think it's a very decent option. Similar to a lot of mid exotics, however, the exotic perk of the weapon isn't really a perk, and it's more so just a unique way that the weapon fires. It's definitely fun to use and useful in mid to harder content, so I think it's another B tier weapon. Merciless is another special fusion that actually used to be a heavy weapon back at the launch of D2. This was also in the DPS meta for a while before it switched over to become a special. I feel like the exotic perk is extremely strong and pairs well with having 8 in the mag, but it just feels underbalanced. If the charge rate was scaled up on non-lethal hits a bit more, this would quickly rise as a top secondary DPS option. And having something more like 10 in the mag might make it stand out a bit more than other legendary fusion rifles. I honestly hope this weapon gets a buff and will find itself back in the meta, because other than Season 15 with particle deconstruction, we haven't seen much use for Merciless. Overall, I think it's a B tier weapon. And then finally for fusions, we have the Holy Toaster. Jotun is definitely a standout exotic. The only major issue is that it's more of a PvP weapon than something super useful in PvE. I think the addition of Incandescent on the Catalyst was a great change for the weapon because it makes taking tankier enemies out much easier, as the explosion will also deal with rank and file adds nearby. Other than when this thing was obliterating Riven and some other bosses, it has been pretty subpar overall, so for me, this is a C tier weapon and is something I could just take or leave. Next up, we are looking at the snipers, and I'm probably just going to throw Ariana's Vow and Forerunner in here too, because let's face it, they're also snipers. First up is the Borealis, which is actually the perfect name for this weapon, because I would rather bore a drill bit straight into my head than ever use this thing. On paper, weapons that switch elements sound like they would be nice with modifiers like match game, but they just aren't. The damage of Borealis is also nothing special, even with the secondary perks, which just has way too much going on. Overall, I think this is a usable weapon, but not in any content that I would consider harder than like base raids, so this is a C tier. After this, we have Cloud Strike. This is definitely great for hitting some clips in PvE, but how does it hold up in the PvE side of things? When it first came out, this thing was actually crazy overpowered, and then it got nerfed, and it never really found its way back into the meta because, let's face it, you might as well just run Izzy if you're using a sniper. The perk Stormbringer definitely makes this weapon best against bosses, and it is a rapid fire frame, so it should have among the highest DPS of special snipers, but for the exotic slot, I just don't think it's always worth it. Definitely better than a lot of other options out there, but ultimately, I think it fits perfectly in the B tier. Izanagi's Burden, as I mentioned, is an absolute beast. This thing needs no introduction as it has made its way into the meta for DPS options for not one, not two, but 3 day 1 raids now. This was used by most teams during day 1 Garden, it was used to get World's First DSC, and it even made its way back for Vow of the Disciple. It smacks champions up in GMs and pairs super well with Divinity, which makes perfect sense because this weapon also belongs in the S tier. Ariana's Vow is another weapon that I consider as a top option. It also falls under the category of having an intrinsic champion mod, which is anti-barrier rounds. This is super useful in endgame against champs, but it also is useful against phalanxes and knights that just have shields. What takes this weapon up to the next level is its catalyst. This increases the round count from 6 to 9, which is huge because it allows you to stun multiple anti-barriers, and then it also gives us autoloading so that we can completely bypass the worst aspect of this weapon, the slow reload speed. Hands down, this weapon is obviously an A tier. And then lastly, for the snipers, even though it's really a sidearm, is the Forerunner. This is another one of those PvP weapons that just doesn't have a real place in PvE, but if I'm comparing it to the shotguns that are F tier, I honestly think it's a lot more useful, especially if you just want to mess around with it or even use mods like sidearm anti-barrier. Nothing special overall, so I'm going to throw this in the D tier. This brings us to the last 2 items on the list, which are the exotic grenade launchers. Brand new from Witch Queen is Dead Messenger. I am in love with almost every waveframe in this game, and Dead Messenger is no exception. It does suck that the main perk is switching between elements and the catalyst is also super mid, but none of that really matters when you kill everything in a 20 square foot area. This thing clears out entire groups of ads, but I don't think it's the greatest for the highest level end game content, so for me, this is in the A tier. And then lastly, one of my favorite exotics, if not my absolute favorite weapon in all of Destiny history, is the Witherhoard. This thing is beautiful. It was crafted by the gods themselves and sent down to Bungie HQ in a glowing golden box. I could spend an entire video covering every use of this weapon. The main aspect that makes this thing great, however, is its versatility in dealing damage and then also being useful for ad clear. The biggest downfall is obviously the reload speed, which the Catalyst completely fixes by giving it auto-loading holster. There isn't a single thing I would change about this weapon, but a lot of you guys brought up a good point that in endgame content, it isn't the most useful. GMs and master raids typically require other loadouts, so for that reason, this is also going in the A tier. This is my full special weapon tier list for PvE, just concerning the exotics. Let me know what you guys think, what you would change, and where you think I might have gotten something wrong. And if you ever want to talk to me directly, you can always do so while I'm live over at twitch.tv/gminers. That's all for this video, guys. As always, have a good one. Peace.